Now, the Home Office is to appoint a senior legal figure to carry out a fresh review into what happened to material handed in by the late MP Geoffrey Dickens in 1983. The dossier allegedly contained information about paedophile activity at Westminster and elsewhere during the 1980s. It is believed the file has gone missing and may have been destroyed. Our Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel reports.
No one is clear if a so-called dossier handed over by the late Geoffrey Dickens MP in the 80s still exists, and if so, in what form. But the spectre of such a document is making life uncomfortable for the government. Ed Miliband today joined a baying mob of backbench MPs demanding action.
We do need a thorough review, and it needs to be a proper review which gets at all the facts about what happened in the Home Office.
And this afternoon, the government responded with details about how it intended to provide additional reassurance. There's been no cover-up. The most senior civil servant here at the Home Office today announced he's to appoint an independent legal figure to carry out yet another review. Mark Sedwell also revealed details of last year's review, which examined close to 750,000 files and found, in his words, no record of allegations of child sex abuse by prominent public figures. That review attempted to establish a full picture, the Home Office said, of what happened to all correspondence from Mr. Dickens, but did not find a so-called dossier that the then Home Secretary Leon Brittan now recalls receiving. It also examined any material about the notorious paedophile information exchange and links to staff at the Home Office at the time. A letter from Mr. Sedwill to the Home Affairs Select Committee today detailed what's already been found from that examination of 746,000 files over a 20-year period. The investigation identified 13 items of information about alleged child abuse, 9 of which were either known or reported to police. The remaining 4 items were given to the police following the review. A Home Office minister in the 80s, David Mellor, today warned against a witch hunt.
I never saw this document, and indeed, I'll come to this point, I think a lot of other people who are talking about it never saw it either. But I remember some sort of chat around the department that this wasn't a very substantive thing at all.
The senior independent legal figure will be appointed next week, but just how long the review will take has not yet been finalised.
We know that well-known entertainers were involved in child abuse in the 1970s and 80s, but this politician was as well. It's claimed the late Liberal MP Sir Cyril Smith went to boys' homes in Rochdale. At the time, the Home Secretary, Leon, now Lord Brittan, was past details said to include claims about other Westminster figures. The parts of it considered relevant were handed to the proper authorities, but more than 100 documents have since gone missing or been destroyed. Claims about a missing dossier were investigated last year, but now the Prime Minister has ordered a fresh look at that process. A senior independent legal figure will assess whether the review's conclusions remain sound.
We've got to be completely transparent in this, and the fact it's getting nearer to Westminster and nearer to politics makes it all the more imperative that no stone is left unturned.
But a review of the review with an as yet unnamed legal figure in charge is not enough for Labour. They want a broader inquiry. It's been revealed the 2013 review found no record of specific allegations of child sex abuse by prominent public figures, but 4 previously undisclosed bits of information have now been passed to the police. And with the backdrop of decades of abuse by Jimmy Savile and this week's conviction of Rolf Harris, the Prime Minister is sensitive to any suggestion of a cover-up at the heart of Westminster 3 decades ago. Robin Brandt, BBC News.
So, lots to talk about. Rather grim newspapers this morning, Lord Tebbit.
Depressing.
Depressing.
Depressingly so.
You've chosen the Simon Danchuk's piece in the Mail on Sunday, which I quoted at the beginning of the programme.
What I find we have to do is to remember the atmosphere of the times. It's very easy to forget that things looked different in those days.
Geoffrey Dickens was widely attacked as a kind of buffoon for raising this at the time.
Yes, indeed. He was widely regarded as a chap who was always falling over his own feet. Also, at that time, I think most people would have thought that the establishment, the system, was to be protected. And if a few things had gone wrong here and there, that it was more important to protect the system than to delve too far into them. Now that view, I think, was wrong then, and it is spectacularly shown to have been wrong because the abuses have grown.
Do you think there was a big political cover-up at the time, back 30 years ago?
I think there may well have been, but it was almost unconscious. It was the thing that people did at that time.
You didn't talk about these kinds
You
of things?
didn't talk about those sort of things. It's not the sort of thing that people did, not even, if I may say so, television journalists, let alone the politicians.
Would have raised it. So a big public inquiry now, do you think?
I think that Mr Cameron is right initially to have looked for a distinguished judicial figure, to have a look at it, to see what the dimensions of the problem are, to report back fairly quickly, I hope.
Yes.
And then will arise the question of what sort of further inquiry is needed into it.
Right. Helena Kennedy, not just Conservatives drawn into this. One of the papers saying there's a Labour peer involved as well.
Yes. Listen, sexual abuse exists in all parts of society, and it would be surprising to imagine that parliamentarians are not going to have, you know, amongst them people who have been involved in it. Powerful people. And people who are powerful, of course, can then use that power to prevent their wrongdoing coming to light. I mean, one of the things, I think Norman's absolutely right. There was a way in which the establishment was able to protect itself, and it felt that actually to expose bad things was to undermine the whole kind of firmament. And we saw it over time. We saw it with Irish cases that went badly wrong. Nobody wanted to examine them closely enough. And I think we've shifted to a time when people aren't going to accept that anymore. There has to be openness and transparency. But going back, this business that there were 114 sex abuse files, I mean, they're in the...
Disappearing dossiers is about the most toxic thing there could be.
Absolutely, because, I mean, it's not as though we don't... I mean, archiving is one of the great things that has disclosed miscarriages of justice. And this is about miscarriage of justice, because it's about people who were making complaints and bringing to light abuse, and they weren't being listened to, and they were actually being written off as being fantasizers and so on. And then it turns out that actually much of this, you know, has truth in it. And it was about not listening, but it was also about men, particularly in power, being able to actually use the system to cover up for themselves. And that goes for celebrities and so on. But it's rather interesting that the attacks on the BBC by parliamentarians are now coming home to roost, because it turns out that Parliament has been the seat of a whole lot of bad stuff that involves cover-ups too.
So a grim time for those of us who love Parliament, but a necessary cleansing coming as well.
I suspect
I think so, yes.
That's right.
This morning by stories swirling around allegations of an historic Westminster paedophile ring. Concern has grown because of the disappearance of a dossier handed over to the Home Office in 1983, along with over 100 official files related to it and possibly containing details of historic child abuse investigations. Labour's calling for a public inquiry led by a senior child protection official into the allegations. But speaking earlier on the Andrew Marr Show this morning, the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, ruled that out.
I think the most important thing that we need to do is to ensure that the due process of law pursues those who may be guilty of individual crimes.
Indeed.
And we also learn lessons about what may or may not have gone wrong in the past. But it's also important, I think, to emphasise that many of the allegations that are being made are historic, and that what we do now in order to keep children safer is immeasurably better and stronger than was the case when 20 or 30 years ago.
Without getting into a boring tit-for-tat, public inquiry, yes or no?
No.
Well, that was clear enough. Helen, can the government go on resisting calls for a full-scale inquiry?
It's very hard because there are cynical and non-cynical reasons for calling for an inquiry. The cynical one is it allows you to say, I can't comment on this, there's an inquiry ongoing. The non-cynical is the fact that it manages to get people to air allegations in a way that is safe, that is non-prejudicial. What we saw at the Leveson inquiry, I think, was really helpful. People who felt they had been shut out from justice, getting a chance to tell their side of the story. For that reason, I think a public inquiry in this case is a good idea. The danger for Labour is they have called for a lot of public inquiries. There was a list made in 2012 of just how many they'd call for, not only Savile, but things like the West Coast Main Line, PIC breast implants. So it can look like a knee-jerk response that everything gets a public inquiry.
But on this particular issue, the people just don't trust the politicians. They don't trust the police either, because they may have been complicit in a cover-up. And they may not even trust the Home Office, who we're told some of their officials were mentioned in the dossier.
Yes, they may not trust the police, but that is what David Cameron is hanging on to at the moment. He's saying this is a matter now because they are alleged criminal activity. It's for the police to investigate. And it's interesting, in that big piece in the Sunday Times by Tim Shipman, he reports that one of the people who's making the allegations lives in the United States, and the police have actually been out to the United States to interview him. So the Prime Minister would say that's how serious the police are taking it. But the problem for the Prime Minister, he is absolutely allergic to big public inquiries. Curious, because his finest moment as Prime Minister was his response to the Bloody Sunday inquiry shortly after he became Prime Minister. But that inquiry took 12 years to report, cost many hundreds of millions, and David Cameron believes that they are costly and a waste of, not a waste of time, but take up too much time.
The problem is the dossier has gone missing. The files have gone missing. More allegations keep coming out, either directly or indirectly. It doesn't look like it's going to go away.
I think that the fact that the dossiers are missing means that it's probably inappropriate for the Home Office alone to be investigating this. But they're not doing it alone. There is also a police investigation. If after that there are questions unanswered which can only be answered by a public inquiry, or which require resources that can only be commanded by a public inquiry, then I could see the case for going down that road. I just fear that sometimes in this country we invest almost supernatural powers in what a public inquiry can do. And I wonder whether internationally there is another example of a country which goes through this stale ritual every few years of a scandal emerging, the opposition calling for an inquiry, the government saying no initially and then either holding the line or giving in. I don't know what we ultimately think these inquiries can do.
Well, I think it comes back to your point, Helen, that you should be careful what you call an inquiry on, so you don't devalue the concept. It could seem to be there'd be nothing more important than child abuse for an inquiry. His constituency in Sheffield. Nick Clegg, welcome to the programme. I want to come on to your situation in the Lib Dems in a minute, but as you will have seen in the papers, there's mounting concern this morning over reports of an historic Westminster paedophile ring and official files related to it mysteriously disappearing. Why are you against a full public inquiry into this?
Oh, I wouldn't rule anything out. I think we should do whatever it takes to uncover the truth and deliver justice. I think that's what everybody wants. I, like no doubt everybody in the country, find the alleged crimes to be of a particularly revolting and heinous nature. The idea of powerful individuals organising with each other and protecting each other to abuse some of the most vulnerable children in society. And of course, justice must be delivered, even all these many years later. The question is how you do it. At the moment, as you know, there is an inquiry in the Home Office about what's happened to these documents. Serious questions need to be asked about what happened in the Home Office, and those questions need to be answered. There are inquiries in the BBC, in the NHS, and most importantly of all, the police are looking into the places where this abuse was alleged to have taken place. And all I would say is, let's make sure that justice is delivered, truth is uncovered, and I think most people would agree that the way to do that, as we've seen in some other notorious cases, is by allowing the police to get on with their work.
Well, you say allow the police to get on with their work, but there are only 7 police involved in this inquiry. There are 195 involved in the hacking investigations. And I think we can both agree that child abuse is rather more important and serious than hacking. And the Home Office, there are reports that Home Office officials themselves may have been mentioned in the dossier. People don't trust people to investigate themselves, Mr. Clegg.
No, I accept that we need to make sure that the police need to make sure that the police investigations are thorough, are well-resourced, because as you quite rightly say, I can't think of anything more horrendous, I really can't, than powerful people organising themselves, and worse still, this is what is alleged, sort of covering up for each other to abuse the most vulnerable people in society's care, children. But at the end of the day, the only way you can get people in the dock, the only way you can get people charged, the only way you eventually can get people prosecuted is by allowing the prosecuting authorities and the police to do their job.
Okay.